Hello, everybody, back in the plenary. We are zooming back in. It takes a little moment to do that in order to see everybody there. Everything worked well. And it seems we are all back by now, are we? Yes, we are getting a sign that we are. So thank you very, very much. We hopefully had a really good discussion. We certainly did in our group. And with addressing quite some aspects here, what we'd like to do in the next step is actually giving a chance to hear from the other groups and to also to react to that, what the other groups have now in this second time around, with much more time than the first time around, came up with and concluded from their side. So we're going to hear from the three groups. We're going to start with auctions. So I'm going to keep on talking for a little moment. And we're going to start with auctions, and then we're going to move stepwise to the fees and to the voluntary payments. So my colleagues Miro and Katarina will be ready to tell you as well. So you're going to hear from me shortly, and then we'll open the floor to any points you'd like to make. Also, of course, if there have been important points omitted from what I present, what my colleagues Miro and Katarina present. So one after the other. So you first hear from me about the auctions, and I'm actually going to share my screen. This is just taking 1 second. I hope not more. And then you will be able to see my screen in just a second. You do. Fantastic. There we go. So what did we do? What did we discuss on the auctions? You all know what I'm talking about because you've been there. You've heard about it. You know about the auctions. So what did we discuss? Now, here is the list. As you've seen, we had a rich discussion, and it focused on definitely the principal questions we had, but we came up with quite a number of them. Of answers and further questions. So one of the things we discussed is the question of efficiency. Is this only a question of money? Don't we have to watch for other criteria? So the thing is that other criteria, qualitative criteria, part of this efficiency that we see. That was one point that has been made. Yes, it is a question of efficiency, and qualitative elements are included, and it's quite important how you set it up in order to do so. There are, of course, other instruments, and it's sometimes the point was made, maybe also a question of the culture that you have for grants in a specific country or setting, a regional setting, local setting that comes into place. We also talked about this wonderful figure of 50% more efficient, which is to be taken with a lot of salt because it's one case on the one hand, but it also means like there might be a learning effect and people understand the mechanisms further as we go on. Still, we think in this group, there was nobody contradicting saying this has potential. Potential, but doesn't come without any issues. And one of those issues is a worry that was quite clearly present in our group about the social acceptability of what we're doing with auctions and reverse auctions, the representativity of those who are going to bet. So, and even the worry further that we're giving perhaps additional power to the few and wealthy. Now, the discussion there was like, well, but it is about landowners and they are the owners. So if you take that as the basis, you don't give additional power necessarily. But there is a question of perhaps setting minimum standards of acceptability for proposals, as an example, and makes also the point that it is not a silver bullet. We're talking about ownership, so the look into the ownership and how to differentiate that is an important question to look at. Ownership when you apply this kind of an instruments, the distribution of landowners there as well. In the Danish case, lots of small plot holders that were involved. So it doesn't mean that by definition this is something for the few and powerful. Now, it needs understanding of this ownership is a clear cut. So in order to avoid any issues that are there, how much they can be avoided, we weren't able to conclude. We know this is an issue, definitely needs to be looked at and considered when using this instrument. Now, coming back to this idea about efficiency, good equalitative evaluation criteria, we also talk about minimum standards of acceptability, etc., are needed. So that's an important thing. There's possibility to learn from others. And that gets us this learning from others, and learning for the future is something that we go back to in just a second. Namely, before doing that, the question of transaction costs and benefits. So who should pay, so to say, and who should take the effort and for engaging in this. Now, of course, in a way, both have to, the state and those bidders, but we should not forget that those auctions and reverse auctions to work, you actually need for this an amount of bidders. High competition is good. So that actually means that they should make the transaction costs on the bidder side as small as possible, so you get that participation. And then what interesting points on that is that you might have found it also a bit difficult at the beginning to understand reverse auction. What are they talking about? It's a bit of a mind twister, and with the auction perhaps as well. It depends how it's brought forward. At the same time, what we seem to have learned, it is indeed about communication, and if once you understand it, it's actually rather easy to do. So it's perhaps a bit the experimental setup that makes it challenging, but it's also about communicating this rightly. And you need to go away from this, were some of the points that were made. These are not conclusions as such. Some of the points that were made that I'm reporting about perhaps thinking about pictures, movies, short messages, not necessarily go into the depth of how this instrument functions, but make it easy for people to participate. Hence linked also the issue of education. You can actually use this kind of instrument to also educate people about stakeholders, about trade-offs concerning application and use of land and use of forests in this case, of course. That is there. And then nice co-benefits, raising awareness, extension services, as one of our participants called them. So we ended up having a short discussion about the need for more testing to prove that this is actually a good instrument, with the caveat that what we saw is that it doesn't always work out in this moment, because there is this learning we still have to do, and failure with public money might be an issue depending on where you are, right? So it's nicer to have the success, of course, but we do learn a lot from failure. So is it a question of more testing to do? Well, different views on this, because some were saying, well, it's there is more testing needed on some of those. You heard about the first rejected price approach that failed in the Flemish case, but the others went quite well. So participants are also saying, well, it's easy to upscale, it's easy to replicate, so let's do it. So that's perhaps something that we need to look into further, into differentiating what and where do we need the testing perhaps more, and where can we go out and say, yeah, do it, interesting, will lead to results. This is where I stop. I hope I gave a reasonable overview of our discussion. Again, these were not necessarily conclusions, and certainly not with any stamp on them. This is a reflection of the discussion we had, and maybe we hear a little bit from the group, or also from the other groups, questions, statements on what we've heard in terms of auctions. The floor is open. I'll leave this slide on just for reference, but maybe some of my colleagues can help me, because at the moment I can't see who is raising the hand.
Yes, Mark, we actually have a raised hand by Gerhard. Nice.
Well, my remark is just that when you hear about auctions, in my view, we have to differentiate the forward auction and the reverse auction. These are, for me, totally different things.
Okay, totally different things. Explain a little bit more, please.
Yeah, because auction is just the mechanism, but what is behind, the business model behind is totally different. If the owner of the forest bids something, well, or if the state wants to have something, gives money for, and then ask owners to bid, that's a different business model and a different mechanism than when the owners offer something to the public. So for me, that is a much bigger difference than just that then it is auctioned.
Okay, thank you very much.
The remark. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that remark. We have Jeroen.
Yes, just your last statement that the other ones are easy to upscale, because basically it was my remark. The discriminative reversed auction is rather easy to upscale. It's not everyone. The discriminative reversed auction is easy to upscale. Rather easy to.
Okay, so that's the discriminative one. Okay, I'm adding this. I'm having some sound issues at the moment, so I can't hear anything at this moment. So maybe Katharina, you could take over.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for those two comments, Gerhard and Jeroen. We also have a comment from Andreas Bernasconi in the chat, who was basically saying that more testing and more integrated planning is needed, I guess. So integrating FES-based value co-production into SFM planning as a requirement is my understanding. But if Andreas, if you want to tell us a little bit more about what's behind that comment, we would be very happy as well, either in the chat or in verbally, if you wish. Because I mean, I can read it, but not being in the group, I wouldn't necessarily know where to place it. But maybe also Alex, Thierry would like to shed more light on this, which would be nice.
I'm sorry, it's because I saw the comment of Mona Nazari in the chat before the one of Andreas, which might have been lost on the using a brand in order to communicate about the auctions. So maybe this one could also be dealt with. Sorry.
Have you heard this, Mark?
Barely. So if you could help me at this moment, that would be great, Katharina.
I think it's good. I think what Alex said also, and it was mentioned in the chat, but I don't see it because I think it came from the group itself, that a brand or branding would help with these auctions to make them more visible and I guess also successful in that on that front.
Okay.
If you could add that.
Yes, will be added to the slide. There are further points while I'm adding.
Yes, I think Andreas is now unmuted himself. So Andreas, if you have more substantiation to your comment in the chat, that would be really helpful for me at least to understand.
Yeah, just to be really short, maybe we can discuss this at the end, but it's a topic that considers all of the cases. So on the slide, it was mentioned more testing, and I completely agree. At the same time, I think the linkages to forest planning are quite important. So how to integrate all these elements into sustainable forest management? What are the implications? And this integration act is very important to me. So maybe we can take this up in the final discussion.
I think, Katharina, this is a very, very interesting point, and Andreas, that you're raising, because it is really about doing something with this now, right? And this integrating into the forest planning more concretely and on the different mechanisms that we have looked at. Indeed, something perhaps at the end, and also something for perhaps if we can't discuss it further here now, otherwise please make your further points on this, but something for Harald and Georg perhaps to take up in their conclusions as well. Right. Just having a look here if I can see you. If there are no further comments at this moment, then I would say we move on to the next group, which is the FES. And Miro, you can please let us know what the outcome of your group discussion has been.
Thank you very much, Mark. And especially thank you, Andreas and Enrico, as well as all the participants in our group, for the interesting discussion and for some interesting outcomes. I hope they will be interesting for you as well. Even though they relate only to fees, they may be generalized, at least to some extent. And forgive me if I repeat certain things that were said in your groups as well, but it seems that as we are all into the forests, the same questions appear everywhere. So first, with regard to the possibility or the potential for replication or upscaling or exportation of certain mechanisms, we have some good news. And Enrico has provided an example of, on the basis of his example for mushroom picking and the fees, he has already replicated that system also for the white truffles and the summer truffles in Italy. And not just in Italy, we also heard that it is being practiced as far as San Diego and Santa Cruz in California. So it is possible to replicate it. It is being replicated. And I think that's a good news for everybody involved. What we also heard is that it is necessary to test how the forest reacts, what the potential there is, and then in function or depending on that, to calculate the fees, because you want to attract people, you don't want to dissuade them. It must be something useful for them. The other interesting outcome or result of our discussion was also that without silviculture and without that knowledge, it is impossible to do anything serious in the area. And I think this is a great point to remember and to take home. Then we discussed for quite some time at quite some length the difficulties of replication. And we mentioned just some. One is the problem with authorities that may have more understanding for it or less understanding for it. They may be more business oriented or less business oriented. There may be problems with competitors who do not always behave in the same loyal way. Talking about applications, talking about using forests even without any entitlement. But it seems that one of the major reasons for replication at a larger scale is that we still have to deal with at least 3 major legal systems in Europe. And you have it on the slide. It's easy if you go from Germany to the west, and it's more difficult if you go from Germany to the east. And our colleagues from Russia also described some of the questions that they have in that regard. So we really have to deal with 3 different legal systems. We continued with that. We also touched upon the potential for replication with regard to the funeral forests. And here Andreas shared some ideas with regard to the possibility of exporting and replicating the template contracts in that area. We have to bear in mind that not every forest owner is as entrepreneurial as the others, but it would be a great help to be able to provide some services, some skills, some templates that those who are interested could use. And then we also realized that even though it is just about a particular service or product, the provider also brings many additional benefits or can bring many additional benefits by designing the service or by designing the application in a certain way. There were interesting examples in Enrico's case. It's not just protection of the mushroom pickers so that they can get lost and they be found, but also the management of the forest. And then the adequate communication channels need to be maintained at all time. Finally, there may be some other barriers to replication, like cultural and institutional barriers. For instance, for funeral forests, it's not always or it's not everywhere allowed to be buried and in that way. So for my part, this is the summary of the conclusions. Of course, Andreas, Enrico, and other colleagues will be will be happy to provide some more information in our discussion. This is it from my part, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miro, for giving an overview of the discussion in your group. First of all, perhaps to the group, any points you would like to add or further elaborate on? No, at this moment, that's very good. Then let's open the floor to the rest of the group. I have Jeroen, who is first. Jeroen.
Yeah, sorry, I clicked rather fast. I'm a bit surprised, especially about the funeral forest and discussion about that. But basically, if you cremate a person, you end up with in the ashes with a lot of phosphates and heavy metals and stuff like that, which is basically poisonous. So you need to be aware. There has to be rules of guidelines of things about where you can administer those things and where you can't. For instance, in Flanders, we have rules about which we follow. So you can't bury an urn with ashes in wet soils, for instance, and all those types of things. So that's something which you need to bring in if you talk about upscaling.
Okay, probably is a question also going to Andreas. What about this ecological effects of burying people in the forest?
That's an important point. I didn't mention it in the summary. So in Switzerland, the cremation is made in a way that there are no heavy metals that rest in the ashes. So that's for Switzerland, that's the basis. So, and then there were studies for the ecological effects, which showed that there is no, from the ecological point of view, there is no negative impact, except it's nourishment of the soil, if you want.
Yeah, apparently there are different points of view of different studies, but it's something you have to take into account. I'm not criticizing, I mean, just something you have to mention.
Yeah, indeed, the point of being like, you can't just let it happen. You need to, you need to be sure about what you're doing. Obviously, it needs to be in line with legislation, but also looking at this environmental impacts. And in the Swiss case, we have a situation where this is not an issue because of the, as you said, right, Andreas, the heavy metal reduction, so to say, that if there is, it needs to happen before. But if it's not, if it is were to be there, obviously we would face a different situation. So important aspect to take into account. Any other points? I mean, we have here quite an interesting subject about the fees, and it seems that if I read well what you discussed, and I'm not sure I do, but I hear very interesting range of mechanisms that can be used. They have their complications. Often legally, if I understand it well, they have their complications, but at the same time, they have this amazing additional value, added value that they bring forward. Is that a correct reading? Maybe it isn't, but I have now Harald and Gerhard would like to make a point here.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask the group who discussed now the fees topic, and you had very much focus on the funeral forests and the mushroom picking. So whether these points that were raised here, they can be somehow also available for other kind of services that are considered, or whatever this is specific now for these two case studies. This is something what I was wondering. I mean, because like legal instruments and cultural institutional barriers and so on, I mean, those issues are valid, I mean, for many different services. But is there something particularly, like we discussed now, this poisoning issue before, where is there some particular issues that are now only for these two, or can this be generalized more? That would be the question.
All right, thank you. Maybe Gerd, we'll come back to you in just a second. I'm just forwarding that question about the particularity really of these findings for the mushroom picking on the one hand and the funeral forest. So is this more generalizable, what you've been saying here? Can we hear something from the group?
Okay, can I talk? Yeah.
Sure.
Well, I think they can be generalized totally. I mean, So first of all, whenever you have a fuzzy law that allow you or you don't allow you to do something in the forest, you need to be very pragmatic and understand if the legal framework is suitable for any kind of enterprise. Then second, whenever you start to put a price, there is an entrepreneur or let's say a public institution that need absolutely to have an idea how to set the price. Usually the entrepreneur is more linked to the demand rather than the public institution. So the public institution, sorry for saying that, overestimate them, while the entrepreneur usually underestimate the possibility he has to generate profit. So these 2 points can be totally generalized. Then when you go in deep on the mechanism application, on a practical point of view, so the one that I represent, so the forest owner, is just how much is, at least in Italy, how big is the issue of bureaucracy in order to put in place that mechanism. Then after that, I think any kind of business must set up in a, let's say, in an environment where you have a clear identification who is your buyer. For instance, in the case of recreational wild mushroom picking are the citizens of Milan area, and how you deliver this service in loco. And then I explained during my presentation how we do. So all the other business run over the how you set the cost and how you set the revenue generation. That's it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Enrico. Very generalizable is what you're saying. And in terms of also the learning and aspects such as bureaucracy and the fact of the profit under and overestimation that is involved in that. Andreas, you'd like to add?
Yeah, thanks. I agree with Enrico. I would say every marketable service which is integrated in a sustainable forest management can be based on these principles taken and used or applied by forest actors.
So very, very bold statements here. We can actually use this in many different ways and not limited to the topics of the 2 case studies that we have here and that we have discussed. Those 2 case studies. It can be much broader applied. And we'll go to Gerhard, who had to wait for a long time now for his comment. Sorry for that, Gerhard.
Thank you, but it fits quite well because now, as you said, there were very bold statements saying that it's broadly replicable, but I want to highlight some limitations because yes, Enrico mentioned it, that it depends on property rights and especially the legal framework, but it's not, and yes, of course, the legal framework is not allowing that in any country. And it's not only the legal framework, but it's also about informal norms. So it's also about how the public perceives the property rights. So like in Austria, they tried licenses for mushroom picking and there was a public outrage and a war on mushrooms. It was called in the newspapers because local people felt deprived of their rights, and that so they perceived that it should not be possible to be sold out.
Okay, thank you, Gerhard. So for the Austrian mushroom wars that we have to watch out here, that possible effect arising. So it seems that we have here another group of mechanisms where we see a lot of potential, judging from what you've just discussed, and there are these issues to take on board here, mainly legal, but also again this issue of perhaps of different groups having a different approach here. So this is something that needs to be taken on, promising with some points next to it. that we've had in this discussion. I'm very interested now to learn from our third group, the voluntary payments, Katharina, if you had a similar result or if this differs for the voluntary payments.
Sure, thank you, Mark. Different to your the last two presentations, we've split ours on 3 slides, but never mind. The idea is here that we cover all of the questions separately, but we also saw that there's some overlaps between them. But coming to voluntary payments, where we had a lot of interesting insights, also local insights from other cases other than the 2 presented from Sincere. So we could build this on quite some practical knowledge from the field. When it comes to the potential of for replication or upscaling of voluntary payments, I think the agreement is that there are limits to this, and that there are certain preconditions to actually allow for this to happen. So it certainly needs to be paired with awareness raising activities, because the donors or the payment providers, they need to know what is it for, why they're doing that, why is it so important. So it cannot just stand on its own and magically happen. There is potential if the benefits for those that pay are clearly identified. So what is it that they get out of it? And also when the offer clearly states whose responsibility it is to come up with these payments and what changes the payments will bring about. It often is actually, often there's no question about is there a potential or not, because it might be the only solution available, because there is a political void that does not allow for other forms of payment to happen in that specific location. So rather than not doing anything, you could do voluntary payments. Ideally, if it should have any potential, there should be a common vision first developed together by all local actors and stakeholders, that then everybody can aspire to and buy into. And then there should be more understanding of the situation and also the need for the payments overall. And not to forget, it requires a lot of work, especially when you do want to involve all stakeholders and discuss with them. So it's not something that happens overnight, which of course, none of the mechanisms we heard earlier are either. But there is, of course, the idea that voluntary payments is something easy to set up, but that's not the case. What should be the focus? We had a discussion of should it be individual visitors or people to the area, or should it go at a higher level? The 2 Sincere cases were more focusing on the individual side of things, but we also discussed that having somebody like the tourism board or an association or whatever in the scheme makes communication often easier, acceptance easier, and of course you don't deal with issues such as vandalism. That was one of the points in the Croatian case from individual visitors. So there is a merit in looking into the higher level of actors. We also discussed that it would be good to, or could be good to get larger companies on board, because then you can really upscale the payment scheme, bigger sums of money, of course, and also a bigger awareness, less actors that you need to deal with. But there are some risks associated. On the one hand, greenwashing of the company. So do they really mean what they say? Or, and we also heard this as an example, it can be causing over success of the scheme, meaning that, for example, the area of land that was reserved for the scheme is used up, because there's so much money flowing into it that you actually need to look for alternative areas to implement the scheme. Then it's very important, and we had that on the first slide already, what's the benefit for those that pay? And we discussed couple of options. So eco-sponsoring could give companies positive PR. For individual visitors, certificates or gifts could be very helpful because they have something tangible in their hands, so really a paper or whatever it is. But of course, it could also good for the good consciousness when you go for carbon compensation ideas of tourists coming to an area, and they could fly, maybe they're flying into the area, and then they could relieve their consciousness by saying, okay, I flew there, but at the same time, I'm offsetting the carbon that my flight causes. So the area that I'm visiting remains pristine. It's an option. And all of that, it's always important to take the local context into account. So as with all sort of replication ideas, it's not a one-on-one copy that you can go with. Lastly, how should the replication upscaling of the voluntary payments be done? As said, it's absolutely essential to pair it with awareness raising, because people need to know more about the context, where things are going, what is happening, and so on. We discussed a lot, not just in the last round, but also in the tour that we did at the beginning, the importance between the importance about the collaboration between different actors and sectors. And in the sector specifically, the tourism and the forestry sector, with the tourism sector not really being aware, at least in the cases that we discussed, not really being aware of the benefits they derive from the forests and the role they play in collecting voluntary payments. So it's not something where they can really withdraw themselves. So a collaboration between different sectors, especially the tourism and the forestry sector, is really essential for any success in that area. Also, other initiatives and NGOs should ideally be brought on board, because they might be the most trusted actors in the location, at least from the public view, and therefore they can bring extra attention, but which could lead to more payments. So just getting the stamp of approval or support there as well. Very important, which I took for granted, but it's of course not, is that there should be a very close link and a direct link between the actual payments and those that are the forest owners, and that it's very clear that that's happening. That might require regulation. So not on the payment itself, but how the let's say the back end of it is actually handled. So there is an element that comes on top of this voluntary nature. It could also be an idea to combine the voluntary payments with other payments. So for example, we had the carbon offset ideas, but also other kind of schemes, so really to create a multi-used forest incentive idea, and not single voluntary payments out. You need a good entity to run the scheme. And that in some cases, it might mean that the focus of activities in the tourism or in the forestry sector need to change, which is not an easy thing maybe to do, or you bring in an external actor to run that scheme for you. Both have advantages and disadvantages, of course. You need to be flexible to design, or you need to be flexible to adapt the scheme to changing contexts or growing size or anything that might happen over time. So there needs to be this fluidity in the design as possible. There needs to be a transparency to see where the donations are going and what is happening with them. And it's essential that there is political support. There's even the idea of maybe pairing the private donations with public donations, do a 50-50 share or anything like that, which also shows that there is the political support. So it's not just on the private donations overall. And then we had, as a last point also in our discussions, that it's now also possible to use logos, for example, the Natura 2000 logos. So the European Commission has allowed that now, which might also be able to help raise awareness on the necessity and also on the validation or validate the idea that this is an important area to conserve, and voluntary payments can help with that. That's from our group. We had a very rich discussion and very active participants. So maybe if there's anything that I missed from the group, do let me know. Otherwise, it goes back to Mark.
Okay, thank you very much, Katharina, for indeed very rich tables here of points. I don't see at the moment anybody raising their hand saying that was overlooked or completely wrongly represented. So thank you very much for that. It's quite striking, I think, how many points came for something that Andreas mentioned in the earlier discussion about the integration of this kind of voluntary payments with other instruments. A lot of outreach you apparently need for this to work. Outreach to organizations, of course, communication, but going much further than that, and involving these different organizations into these kind of schemes in order for them make sense. Is that a good, is that a correct statement, Katharina, or am I saying something wrong?
Oh, I think that's a good representation of the discussions. So yeah, no, certainly I would agree, and I think the group would agree too.
Okay, thank you very much. Now to the rest of you, to this quite a lot of points that have been brought forward, and to the rest of you, your ideas and contributions. I see Clara having raised the hand. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you very much for the really interesting presentation. I have a question. If you could elaborate a bit more on the combination of voluntary payments with other payments like carbon offsets, because I didn't hear it in the group and I would be very interested. Thank you.
Very good.
To carbon offset.
If I may play this to my group, because I'm not the expert on it, my first instinct would be, could this be a question to Lisa? But I'm not sure, Lisa, if you're comfortable answering. But yes, hand is up. So very good.
Thank you. This idea came from discussion with the tourism sector, who is using the landscape, the attractive landscape, and also biodiversity brings extra value to the environment, what the nature-based tourism is using. But the sustainability demands in tourism business have increased a lot, trying to be carbon neutral in our latitude. This is a big challenge, but still forest can provide a solution to the carbon offset. So we've been analyzing also what kind of measures could combine those ecosystem services that tourism is interested, landscape, biodiversity, plus the carbon offset, carbon storage potential. So there are some solutions that could combine this, like prolonging the rotation period, total protection, and so on. We have new information from research that actually in our latitudes, the forests act as a carbon storage rather long time. So we regenerate forest in 80, 90 years, but it could go another 90, 100 years more, and because the decomposition is low. So that would be a potential that we actually try to go forward with that idea, because we now we are looking at our forests, what could they provide for rural livelihoods, other than also that forest industry in Finland.
Okay, thank you. Lisa, Clara, does that answer your question?
Yes, yeah, thank you very much. If you have literature on this, I would also be interested. Thank you.
Okay, there we go. Right, the next steps are taking here. Mona, you also would like to say something.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you all for these productive sessions. I really learned a lot. Actually, I wanted to, I already asked my question in the test, but I wanted to maybe say it again. So as we learned from yesterday and today, I think communication is one of the main issues in the modern context. So I think advertising is the best form of communication, which can reflect and shape society, especially nowadays. It also has the effect of normalizing values or behavior. So how do you see the role of social media in such an action, like improving voluntary payment or advertising some specific auction? The approach can start first with the branding, as consumers generally believe that brand deliver on the promise of user satisfaction, and they use the power of social media and influencer to advertise it after that. What do you think about it? Thank you.
Thank you very much about the question of communication, more specifically social media, in the role it could help and could play in helping to bring about the desired effects that we have been talking about. Any point here? I think Harald, in one of the discussions where I was at, you mentioned the importance of being straightforward, short, graphic, and visual with stakeholders involved in order to get them on board. And Lisa also has her hand up, but Starting with you, Harald, do you agree social media important role or not so much?
I think when we perceive, I mean, today's media and how we perceive information and how we actually communicate, so then actually we learn quite nicely how information should be processed and presented, that it's digestible for the public. So that's why I have a strongly position that this social media will have to play a strong role in the future communication and also advertising and the awareness rising of payment services schemes. This is my strong belief. I mean, we will see how this is then also practically be implemented. I mean, this is then another issue where then research is then very important, and the role of research in that field also to learn about the mechanisms behind, because there could be also a lot of misuse, what we discussed also. I mean, it's also about trust building and all these issues. So that's why I think it's a really key and important topic. I agree.
Okay, thank you, Harald. Lisa, was your hand raised and lowered by now?
Yes, thank you for the social media. That was our main tool to link to this fund collection in Kuusamo, because of the tourism board wanted to go to digital marketing and use active social media. And I think it depends on the target audience, how actively they are following social media. On a holiday, you might not be there all the time if you want to be in peace and enjoy the landscape and the nature. But I think it definitely has a role. And yes, but I think we also, in our case, we needed the support from traditional media was very welcome, TV and radio, to spread the word, but we would have needed even more this kind of awareness raising, but we had troubles finding the trading agents, so we got the pilot running very late. So where maybe if we were able to prepare better in advance, we would have had a better result. But we managed to recruit a professional marketing company who said that this task is really difficult to communicate. And we really discussed with them, what is the message? How we're going to communicate this? So we had this discussion with a company we subcontracted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And the last comment from Mireia.
Yeah, also maybe expanding on communication, I think for who is paying, it's important to know where this payment goes. I think I will highlight the transparency, but I also will highlight the impact on the ecosystem service. So at the end of the day, we have talked a lot about paying to the owners, but I think I mean, that's an option, but maybe I think for appealing more to the civil society, it's not a payment to the owner, but a payment for doing something with that money that benefits the environment. So I think that should be also taken into account. And then I'm also wondering, because for instance, at least in Spain, we have already taxes or fees. If you want to spend overnight in a hotel, in the bill you get at the end, it's I don't know, it's €2, or I don't know, it's a 10% percentage, but this fee is already existing. So I'm wondering as well if it's more a kind of political battle to really make that these already existing fields goes for the management of this forest for the public sector or the private, but still for the management. So that's also a comment.
Okay, thank you very much, Mireia, also for reminding us that it is in the end about the effect that we would like to see on forest ecosystem services, of course, and on the goals we set with this kind of initiatives and mechanisms in order to use them. So that feedback loop, closing the loop is quite important also in terms of transparency, as you mentioned. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going very, very close now to the end of our session. And we have Georg Winkel and Harald Wacik, who are the project leaders of Sincere. And NOBEL, respectively, who will help us a little bit to place the whole setting. As far as I'm concerned, Georg and Harald, I heard about two set of mechanisms where there was a lot of potential and quite a number of issues to address, and one where the potential was perhaps lower, but which had the potential in the other way, namely being integrated and supportive in a much larger sense. But do let us know, what are your takeaways? Well, and how can we go further with those insights we now gathered from this practice viewpoint, this practical perspective on the mechanisms in these two projects? Georg, perhaps first, and then Harald.
Okay, yes, thank you, Mark. Yeah, what to conclude and what to do from there? It's difficult to say now, but perhaps a few thoughts. First of all, I think it was really enjoyable for me. It was very interesting, was very rich discussion in the group where I have been, but also in the other groups that have been presented now. And there were quite a lot of interesting ideas, including in the chat, quite some interesting discussions. And also in the perspective of the yesterday policy discussion, I found this quite interesting and complementary. Looking a bit back now in Sincere project, because we're moving towards the end, even so we now will be extended for 3 months, is that I really think it did some really interesting things in this project on this practical side. The reverse options, the funeral forest, the Kusamo idea that was presented today, to perhaps with some cautions, the Croatian case where it was much more difficult to implement the ideas that the Croatian partners had. I think there's a lot there. There's quite some success stories to see. Of course, also failures that are also telling, depending on the context, possibly also on the initial ideas that were there. And there were also some COVID effects. But I think there's some really cool things that have been done in the project. And this leads me to this point of forward looking. So what to do with that now in the remaining project term and possibly behind. I think today we discussed a bit conditions and ways for replicability and upscaling. There were some interesting discussions on the institutional settings, socioeconomics and cultural barriers. And I think it would be very valuable to also look into our large-scale surveys we did with forest owners, where we asked about partly similar issues, and to develop a bit something like a concrete roadmap, which I think we plan to do, how upscaling could be working. I think from a research side, there were some really interesting ideas. This aspect of integration was mentioned, so how to embed these innovative mechanisms into a bigger policy approach, looking also back into the yesterday's policy discussion, but also what are really the effects on the landscape within a policy mix. For me, coming more from the social science side, would be really, really interesting to follow up with some concrete kind of implementation research to look in the on-the-ground effects, but also to look a bit on a landscape perspective. So what is the niche? What is the possibility for those tools to resolve some of the conflicts we have at the EU level currently between different perspectives on forest ecosystem services? But then finally, I think what is something that I really now think about more concretely than 2 hours ago is really learning by doing. So I think we need to think about in the remaining months and since here, we heard a lot of the nuances, and is it really successful, and what are the effects? We don't know exactly. Is it 50% more efficient in terms of costs, the Danish example, and then if you do it again, would it be only 20% and so on? But I think what we should really try to do is now to explore these practical replications possibilities. So for instance, we have a huge discussion here with large-scale private forest owners in the Sauerland nearby Bonn on new payment systems and what could be done to help them. Now they are in this, let's say, a forest crisis. So we have another project. We just got funding yesterday to work with them. Why not try these things out there again on a larger scale? And why not now really try to work with this and to have this combination of further research to understand better with really trying to replicate some of the success or potential success stories of the project. I think this is very motivating, and we should really use the time for that in the remaining months of the Sincere project. So I think that's my comments so far. There were many more things that could have been said, but I have a longer list here. Thanks.
Thank you very much for giving us a glimpse of that long list that you have, and actually for pointing out that there is quite a lot we can take on from here, and also practice and see how we can move this forward now in additional applications, learning more and making it more ripe. Yeah? So that's what for broader application as discussed here. Harald, from your side, Nobel project, what would you like to share as your conclusions?
Yeah, even harder now because what should be said after such a long day already, and all the kind of issues that were raised were absolutely right. So I agree with Georg. It was a really nice overview, and it also motivates, I mean, for continuing on that subject and exploring the different options. When I was thinking about now in the last couple of minutes, what could be concluded? I mean, yeah. So I tried maybe to find 4 overarching topics, or you could say like themes that helped me a little bit to summarize these issues. And I would call them now the 4 important C's, if you would like to say like that. So I have 4 C's for you. So the first C is about competence. So I think it's very important that we understand the mechanisms, the tools, the methods, the models that we use. And we have also learned a lot about scientific knowledge that is somehow coming up, not only from our research projects, but also expert knowledge, knowledge from the practitioner's point of view, layman knowledge. So all this information that is available in order to make such kind of payment fixed services schemes successful. So, and I think that's a key issue, and we have to really learn about that. So it's about competence. The second C I was identifying is about commitment. So it's very important that all the actors, we talked a lot about stakeholders, we talked about the buyers and the sellers and their roles in the different payment for services schemes. It's very important that they commit themselves to this idea. It's about building trust. It's about also confidence, so that this can be a success, so that actually at the end you can make this a success. It's about also solving conflicts. This was also mentioned several times, how to make sure that we are not really running into big troubles. Yeah? And so for that purpose, a lot of issues have to be done in order to make people committed to such a payment fixed services scheme. The third C that I would raise now is about communication. Was also raised several times. I mean, we have to explain, we have to communicate about the importance of forest system services. We have to increase the understandings. There are also a lot of worries about whether this is now social acceptable, or whether we'll have other challenges related to that. So it's a lot about communication. And the last point that we also made now about this short way of communicating with videos, images, social media. I mean, so there's a lot of issues that we have to better understand of how we communicate as scientists, but also from practitioners and forest management point of view, how to communicate properly with our buyers who are interested in the services that we can offer. And maybe the fourth C now is about collaboration. So it's also, I think I find it quite striking. In one of the slides, it was mentioned that there's still the need for knowledge about silviculture, about forest management. You need the different disciplines. You need the different competent actors in that field in order to make such kind of payment for eco-services schemes successful. And when we do this kind of collaboration, we discussed this in our auctioning session. You could call these are high transaction costs, because you have to collaborate with a lot of people, you have to communicate, you have to discuss it. This is quite costly. But there was also the other argument, what I liked very much, that you could also see this as a co-benefit. Because when you collaborate with others, then you can also learn a lot from the others. You can do trainings, you can raise awareness, and you can convince others about the idea about certain services. And I think this is maybe also a nice aspect, especially when we talk about these multiple forest ecosystem services. So not just focusing on one single, but we would like in the whole landscape, we would like to have then multiple forest ecosystem services be provided simultaneously at the same landscape. So then you need really the collaboration of different stakeholders and actors to make this happen. So that's why I have a strong belief that we need these different disciplines working together. So that's maybe my conclusion. This would be the 5th C now. I mean, on this issue, and I close now my statement here.
Okay, thank you very much, Harald, for your 5 C's then in the end. And we are indeed at the end of this session of the Sincere NOBEL Final Conference. And it rests for me to say a big thank you to all of you who have presented and participated in this very rich discussion. Thank you very much for that. That's what we need to bring things forward, the two-way street, and that's what we hope to have here. If you are participating in our business models session at 14 hours, which is the final session of this conference, then you can just stay put. You can mute your microphone and you put off your camera, stay put otherwise. So the connection is already there. We start again at 14 hours. If you haven't thought about doing that, maybe you got inspired to do it now, because some of those points obviously are very much linked to the question of how can we get that into business models that will work. So that's the discussion at 14 hours. Again, a big thank you for all of those who presented, some of them 3 times, remember? So wonderfully done, and for all the great contributions. Let's take this on from here. Let's not leave it in those 2 projects. Let's do something with it. There's a lot of value here, and you underlined that in this session. See you back at 2 o'clock. Have a great break.